Hi, BookTube. Welcome to a book chat with myself, Peg at the History Shelf, and Bill Ruttenberg, the
Hey guys.
Ruttenberg Library, although you're not really at the Ruttenberg Library right now, are you?
No, I am sitting in my classroom. We found last time that we did our buddy chat, we had some internet connection problems from my house, so I thought this would probably be the easier way to do it.
Yes, yes. And it looks so school-like. I like the planets on the border behind you there.
Yep, it's the one thing I've gotten ready this year so far.
That's cool. Awesome. Well, we are here to, we finished this book on a buddy read about a month ago, right? I mean, but we're still pretty fresh to it. But we wanted to talk about, it's a relatively new release. It's Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary Fighter for Racial Justice by Bruce Levine. And I have my copy, and Bill's got his copy, and we're just going to kind of talk about, there it is. He's got the nice library edition. We're just going to talk a little bit about this recent release. This was put out by, who's the publisher? Simon and Schuster. And get our thoughts on it, because we were really excited for this, weren't we, when this first came out?
Yeah, because we've been reading, we're both Civil War fans, and I think we have a lot of things in common with the Civil War and trying to end slavery, and all of that kind of stuff that goes with it. And so Thaddeus Stevens, that was just pretty much right there in our wheelhouse. And I had not read anything on him before as like a solo biography, and so I was really excited to read this. And I think, did you share the same thing, or had you read the Fawn Brody?
I had not. And that's another thing I wanted to talk about in this video, is because it seems it's hard for me to find a copy of that other biography. I'm still looking for a good used copy of the Fawn Brody. But yeah, I mean, when it came out, I was excited because I was like, okay, I want to really kind of know more about Thaddeus Stevens. And for many of you history fans out there, this is not gonna, you know who Thaddeus Stevens is, right? But for those of you who don't, he was a congressman from Pennsylvania, primarily during the, what you call like antebellum period, and then through Civil War. He didn't really survive too long after. I mean, I think he died during the Johnson administration, right?
Yeah, pretty quickly, pretty soon after.
Yeah. So well, we'll get into what he believed in and all that, but basically there's not a lot of that I found a lot of biographies out there about Thaddeus Stevens. And the one we're talking about is one by Fawn Brody, which was probably written the 50s, 60s, maybe the 60s,
something like that.
Yeah. So I still want to get my hands on that one to compare, but I think that one's a little bit more, hopefully more in depth, kind of really explores the archives and his papers. This book is I think it worked well on the level of introducing people to Thaddeus Stevens. Wouldn't you say?
I think so. It was a really good introduction, or a popular history.
Yeah.
And lets the average person get to know Thaddeus Stevens a little bit. Like you said, I think the Fawn Brody book goes into a lot more detail than what this one does. It's probably more for the history nut, is my guess.
Yes. So us, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
So we'll probably work on getting our own copies of that, and maybe in the future we can, read that one as well. But yeah, so it's a popular history, this book by Bruce Levine, and it was very well written, flowed very nicely. And we can talk about some of the things that stood out about the book, or at least about Thaddeus Stevens. Do we want to kind of go over the what we found compelling, and then what we kind of had wished for?
Well, I guess I agree with you. Very well written. And it flows very well, pretty easy to understand. I would like to have seen some more detail on Stevens in, later on in the book. It gets into the legislation side, when he's pushing for the 13th Amendment and stuff like that. And I would really have liked to have seen more of the letters that he wrote back and forth to congressmen, more into the speeches that he gave. But Bruce Levine goes into more of the other characters and how they all kind of blend. And again, I think that's more just because it's a popular history.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want to bog down the reader. That's my guess anyway. But I would like to have seen a little bit more depth as far as that goes.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think that was the thing we both touched upon immediately. It was like kind of skim the surface. It's like you didn't get to really know the inner Thad Stevens. Now I don't know if that was something that Fawn Brody was able to do or not, but so that remains to be seen. We'll withhold verdict on that. But what he does do in this book, I think, is really touch the high points of Thad Stevens' career, and as well as touching on his evolution, as a politician, but also as a man, where his moral standing was, and the fact that, he was born in Vermont. And there was a section in the book in the beginning where I didn't realize this, that Vermont had such a tradition, I guess, of like freedom. I thought it was like, isn't New Hampshire live free or die or something like that?
But Vermont, it goes back to, and he hits on this in the book. It goes back to that argument between New York and New Hampshire, who owned the land grants, and that's where that independence streak came from.
Okay, right.
He really hits on that, and then because of that, the people who live there have that independent streak themselves. And I thought he did a pretty good job of, at the beginning of the book, setting that up and in essence building the character of Thaddeus Stevens, like his groundwork. Where does he come from? Mm-hmm. And I took a quote out of there. He was talking about, if you don't mind me reading here real fast.
Please.
Stevens' Vermont upbringing played a large role in his belief of individual rights. Yankees had a code of cultural, economic, and political values deeply rooted in New England. And then this is a direct quote from the book here. Those included belief in democratic government based on a broad-based suffrage and a conviction that the best society was one whose members owned their own small farms and whose mutual assistance helped to prevent creation of great extremes of wealth and poverty. Individual rights were prized, but personal interests must not threaten the welfare of the community. And I thought that really went well, that paragraph in the book, when you're starting to look at the end of the book, when he's talking about making sure that African Americans, as they came out of slavery, they all owned their individual farms so that they could have that economic independence. And I really like how he hit it there. And then he comes back to that. He comes full circle towards the end of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great point that you brought up, because he does, Levine kind of really goes into some detail about his belief in as I wrote down in my notes, the curative power of economic development. Mm-hmm. And one of the key, pillars of that is land ownership. Mm-hmm. And so in the beginning, he's kind of looking at things from like a free labor, a free soil type of, he's coming from that standpoint politically. But at the end, he's realizing, look, we can't give, we can give the right to vote to African Americans, but without like land ownership and an investment in the country and the system, that vote's going to mean that it's not going to hold any sway, So I really thought that it was, he's basically saying that, Stevens's belief in capitalism, incorporates everyone of all races and can give to all races the same type of rights, privileges, and power. Mm-hmm. So I think that was actually really forward thinking for a man in the mid 19th century.
Well, and I'll throw another one in there. As a teacher, I always love it when I see these historical characters such as Thaddeus Stevens, how they really latch on to education. And they find the importance of education. I just smiled the entire time I was reading that. Yep. And, later in his career, as he gets into being he was in the Pennsylvania State House, right? Mm-hmm. And he was really pushing for the bill to be passed so that education was going to be paid for by the public, at least for the lower classes who could not afford it, to try to give them some footing. And if you're going to make voters out of them, in order for a democracy to be successful, you have to have an educated voter. And if everybody doesn't have access to education, what good is it? And so I really liked how he fought for public education and helping everybody be on a somewhat equal playing field. Maybe the rich could get a little bit more, but at least the poor could get something.
Right. I also was very much appreciative of that stance that he took. He was pro economic development, whether you want to call that pro capitalism, but he was also very much pro education. And not just, he was pushing, like you said, for education for all levels of society. He was definitely he was not a classist, you know what I mean? He was, I think he was really a man of the people in that sense. And in all senses, really. There wasn't really anything about Thaddeus Stevens as portrayed here that I didn't like. And Levine is very honest about, some of his less savory decisions, there's a point in time where he kind of aligns himself with the nativist party, anti-immigrant, but he wasn't there for too long before he was like, okay, this is not right, and pulled back from that.
Yep.
So I appreciated that. I always appreciate a person who can be honest about, well, I went this way, but that wasn't a good way. And
they recognize their mistakes.
Yes.
Try to fix those.
Yes. But yeah, I think one of the things besides the economic development, I'm looking at my notes here really quick.
While you're looking, I'll tell you another thing that I appreciated about him. I have, and it's just me, but I really like to root for the underdog.
Yeah.
It's my background and everything. I started out as an underdog when I was a little kid, and as I grew up and what I came out of from my situations. And so I really appreciate the underdog. Mm-hmm. And when you read about Thaddeus Stevens, for those that don't know, Thaddeus Stevens was born with a club foot.
That's right.
So that's definitely a limiting factor in what he can do as a young man to prove that he's a man, because you got all of his classmates or his people that are his age, they're wrestling around and they're doing, manly stuff, trying to, show each other up. And there's a lot of that stuff he can't participate in because of that club foot. He just can't keep up. Right. And so I had a question for you, and I asked these questions, wrote them down, and then as I got to reading a little further, they kind of answered it. Levine answered it in his opinion, but I was wondering your opinion. Mm-hmm. Did having a club foot give him added sympathy for the less fortunate? Did it foster the need to do something with his life despite that disability? Was that something he was trying to overcome? Was it a launch pad for him?
Yeah.
I'm not going to let this hold me down. Do you think that?
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. And it seems like it's almost without him articulating that, maybe say in a private letter to a friend about, how he grew up and where his sense of, camaraderie with people who are facing some type of disadvantage, whether it's physical, economic, mental, emotional, whatever. I would like to think that it had something to do with it, but not necessarily. I think, I think Lincoln, he didn't have anything, setting him back, but he was very sympathetic and to the plight of people. So, but I think if anything, his physical disability probably, I think, made him probably move more into a deeper study. Like, he studied classics. I think he took that, what he couldn't channel physically, I think he channeled it mentally and intellectually into study, into politics, and trying to make a change in that way. Somehow kind of, he's sublimating, the fact that he had a disability into, okay, but I'm going to do this, and make a change for many more people than just myself. So I hope that answers. I don't know. I mean,
no, that answers it.
I think I'd like to think that it had an element to his empathy with people. But yeah, he did have to overcome some things early on in life,
Yep. Well, and building, I also think back to the movie Lincoln, where Tommy Lee Jones plays
Yes
Stevens, and you can't talk about better typecasting. They look exactly alike.
They do.
Anyway, I think of, with this disability and building his mind, like you said, it made him, he was quick-witted, and I think that played into it. And if you've seen the movie Lincoln, Tommy Lee Jones does an awesome job of depicting that, and his snappy comebacks in Congress. And one thing that I really liked about this book is, I love that movie. I thought it was an awesome movie. But I sat there thinking to myself, is that really how Thaddeus Stevens talked in the halls of Congress? I mean, it's Congress. You shouldn't be talking like that.
Oh,
Thaddeus Stevens, he said
but they did.
Yes.
I know. Can we get, I hope I wrote down the page numbers. I wanted to share some of those quotes. I mean, he was not only witty, but they were very cutting remarks.
Yeah. I have pulled up the records of Congress before. I don't know if I shared this with you, but I read some of that stuff from the Compromise of 1850, and some of the stuff that the Northerners and Southerners were throwing back and forth at each other. I'm telling you what, they did not pull punches. It was all out.
Yes.
Cutting, like you said, and Thaddeus Stevens was the king of it all.
Oh, he was the king of the cutting quip, the cutting remark. And Levine says several times in this book, when Stevens stood up to give a speech, remember in some of the places it would be like his compatriots, like the people who agreed with him, would rush towards the rostrum or whatever, because they were there to protect him. Like, this was serious, people. He really, because then the Southerners were getting up in arms over some of the things he was saying, and his compatriots would sometimes gather around him to protect him. At other times, the Southerners would get there first and would be up in his face, like, and this wasn't too long after Charles Sumner got his head bashed in, right?
Yes. I mean, this is the time period where they'd cane him, they'd shoot him. I mean, all kinds of stuff.
He had no fear. He had no physical fear.
Yeah, and that was the great thing about him. Again, rooting for the underdog here. They're up in his face, and he knows that danger. He doesn't stop. He doesn't shut up. He keeps going. If anything, it makes him louder. And yes. I don't know. I just thought that was fun to read.
It's fun to read, and he's like my hero. Yeah,
I was like, be there.
Yeah, I want to be there. I want to cheer him on, because you know what? He spoke truth to power, and the power at the time before the Civil War broke out was the slaveholding elite, the congressmen in the South.
Yep.
I mean, the more I've read about this period, it wasn't taught to us, as kids about the antebellum. It was just about, they didn't, teachers don't have a lot of bandwidth, I think, to go into a lot of the details or to go really in depth, because you have a certain amount of time, right, to teach a unit of things.
Well,
or do you not? I don't know.
Oh, I spend a long time on this. It's my favorite unit.
Okay, well, I know you do.
Teachers tell me, "What are you thinking? Why are you spending so much time?" I'm like, the kids love it, though.
That's so
learning.
Stick with if they're learning, stick with it, But like when I was a kid, I just learned, well, the North and the South, they had a disagreement. The more it's
not just a disagreement.
No, and the more I have read over the past, I would say even just the past 10 years, the scholarship that has come out and things I have read really underline the fact that the balance of power for the longest time in the United States was with the South.
Southern, yeah.
And they used it with like a cudgel against the North. Then, you get a lot of the revisionist historians who like to just paint it as the North being a bully and the moving in on states' rights. And but it's like, if you read how they were manipulated, the North was manipulated by the South time and time again, and they kept bowing down and being, ingratiating themselves. It just makes me angry when I read this stuff. And this book really covers a lot of that. Yep. And Thad Stevens was alive during this time, and he's like, this is BS. Mm-hmm. Why are we placating these people? They, you know what I'm saying? I mean, again, I'm getting fired up. I'm getting head voice, but
that's all right.
I love that Thad Stevens, he called truth to power. Mm-hmm. And, and they didn't like hearing it. But like, let me see if I can find this one quote, because he really stuck it to him. Oh God, let's see here. It says at the end of the speech, his allies rushed to protect him, forming what in infantry terms would be called a square defense, surrounding him with a four-sided human shield, because it was okay. So here he goes. Do you mind if I just read a little?
What page you on?
Okay, 113 to 114. I'm on the bottom of page 113. Oh yeah, and it really goes into as well Thaddeus Stevens's how he had big issues with James Buchanan, one of our worst presidents ever, right?
Oh, not one of the worst. He was the worst.
The worst. Buchanan.
He was a moron. Don't even get me started on that. He was a moron.
I know. Buchanan also just enraged me in this book. I mean, it's just like,
got something wrote down for that too.
Okay, well, let's get into it. But I'm going to read this little quote here. It might be a couple of paragraphs, but it says, because Buchanan was basically trying to blame the North for all the stuff that was happening and the upheaval. And it says here, Stevens dismissed the president's attempt to blame the North for the national crisis, coming from, quote, a man who during his whole political life has been the slave of slavery, end quote. He said on January 29th, that attempt was not worth a moment's consideration. The North had not abrogated the rights of the South, nor were such alleged abuses the real reason why slaveholders were now pulling the Union apart. Their real grievance was simply that, quote, and this is Stevens talking, the North has taken from them the power of the government, which they have held so long, end quote, which is very true. Let's see here. And so he was basically saying that, this was on the eve of, after Lincoln had been elected, right? And Buchanan was still a lame duck. Mm-hmm. And Stevens is saying, look, the voters had merely done what it was their right to do. They elected a person, the man of their choice, to be a president. In doing that, quote, no violence was used, no malpractice is charged, but the American people dared to disobey the commands of slavery. And this is proclaimed as just cause of secession and civil war, end quote. The sitting president's, as he calls it, impotent conclusion that the government was powerless to defend itself against what even Buchanan called an illegitimate and mortal attack was simply absurd. So, yeah, I mean, he kind of laid it out for them that, it says here, in the face of those clear provisions of what the Constitution says, Stevens concluded, it seems strange to hear that a great wrong may be committed against the Constitution and no power exists to prevent or punish it. Posterity will wonder whether the statesmen of this age were fools or traitors. And so during the speech, it says here, scores of congressmen from the South, the upper South, still in the Union, advanced upon Stevens again, cursing and threatening him. And he was just like, and his buddies all ranged around him, forming a Napoleonic square, and it's just like, and he did this time and time again. Yeah, tell me what you have on that, because I just found this section really fascinating.
Well, mine was, you're gonna have to give me a second here.
Oh, sure, no problem.
Mine was the idea, here it is. I put President James Buchanan was terrible. These are just notes to myself.
Oh, I love it.
He was indecisive, wishy-washy, and quite simply the worst president the United States has ever had. Now that's my words.
Drop the mic.
but then I put also, this is the one that, I mean, just baffles me. Buchanan recognized the South doesn't have the right to secede, but neither does the U.S. government have any power to deal with it. To me, it's he doesn't want to take any ownership of the thing.
No.
He's just trying to melt softly into the background.
Like Homer Simpson.
Oh my gosh.
into the bush.
He just wants to disappear. Let somebody else take it. I mean, you think of Truman, the buck stops here. Well, it was the buck started there.
That's right.
Passing it on.
That's right.
And he had every opportunity to deal with some of this stuff. And you got all these problems. I mean, and I'm getting off topic here.
That's all right.
With Buchanan, you get all these problems, these domestic problems, this stuff going on at home, stuff that should have been addressed. He ignored every bit of it and put all of his presidency into foreign politics. And all his problems were right there on his doorstep. They weren't.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, it's because, he sympathized. He sympathized with the South. He had friends in the South. And that's what it was.
Mm-hmm. Plain and simple, he wanted slavery to stay around, or he wanted to make the slaveholders happy. Maybe that's the way to look at it.
Right. And, and it's just so antithetical to what America was established to be, obviously, was that we didn't want aristocracy. We didn't want, hereditary, It
was everyone's worst fear.
It was, but that's what the large plantation owning slave owners and who were in politics and had tons of money. I mean, I'm not talking about all Southerners. I'm talking about these massively powerful plantation owners that were running the halls of Congress.
Yep, or
in the Senate,
or whatever the percentage was. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, they were an aristocracy, and they were dictating the terms. To what was supposed to be a republic, and it was just, and that's why Stevens was so, I think, just critical at that time and place.
That's not fair. It's plain and simple, not fair.
Not fair. Not even touching on the slavery aspect, because obviously that is just a whole nother, element that was just a blight on the country and on just human rights in general. But so I mean, Stevens was talking back to that on many levels, not just economic, but also just the values of the country, and then morally, how do you justify this? Which also touches on the fact that although he identified with the church, I was surprised to find in the book that a lot of his closest compatriots said that, he wasn't really all that deeply religious. So I thought that was interesting, but he did use a lot of the biblical language, in touching on slavery and needing to, and who knows, I wondered later in life if he actually got more in touch with his faith. I think in the beginning he was more in his head and, very much a child of the Enlightenment, but went to church, but his friends were like, well, he wasn't all that. I wanted more of that from this book. Actually, I wanted more.
Well, and some of that would come, like we said, with his letters and stuff like that, a little bit more in depth.
Yeah,
but that's all right.
But so I think we covered a lot of just how Stevens was a very brave individual, physically and just physically brave at the time, but also ahead of his time in championing radical rights, right? The radical fighter for justice, equal rights. So, did you find anything interesting about how in the beginning of his career, he went into like an anti-Mason type of organization?
Some of that went over my head.
Yeah.
Just being honest.
Yeah. Well, some of it was just like, I think at the time there were people that were really fearful of secret societies and Masons and stuff like that. And it just says in the book that, Stevens was against any type of secrecy in politics in general or in society. There shouldn't be secrets. Yeah.
Well, what kind of stuck out to me is just how many times he switched parties.
Oh, yeah.
Went from anti-Mason to what else was he? He was an anti-Mason. He was a Whig. He was a Republican. He was What am I missing?
Well, there was that nativist party. What did they call
Natives,
themselves? Was it Know Nothing? But he was
American
never a Know Nothing, though, was he?
American Party.
American Party.
Know Nothings was the nickname of it.
That was the nickname. Okay.
Yeah, and that one blew me away too. Like, how could you? You're talking about the land of opportunity, but yet you're not going to let everybody have an opportunity.
Yeah. Luckily, he didn't stay there real long.
Yeah, he didn't stay with it very long. So
yeah, I think at some point later in his career, he's probably very, he distanced himself and was kind of ashamed of that,
Yeah.
Because later on he had a lot of pro immigrant things to say, and he fought for their rights as well.
Yeah, he totally does a 180 on that.
And yeah, I think wasn't he also kind of like championing or at least saying, we need to not be oppressing or targeting, Irish and Catholic. And I think he was. I don't have the exact page number here, but even though, because we're history nuts, we're kind of, oh, we wish there was more. I can't say enough about the book, though, to say that this is a great introductory and even intermediate level book. Yeah. For anyone who wants to kind of get into this period a little bit more and see it from the perspective of a fighter for racial justice, this is what Stevens was, and a large part of that obviously was his fight for slavery. So that, I think maybe that leads us into the next portion, which was a large portion of the book, which kind of talks about after Lincoln was elected, and then war began.
Mm-hmm.
And, Stevens was very active in Congress, working to support the troops in the war effort. But he early on, he saw the need, like, we need to end slavery, because not only will this end the war fast. I mean, well, first of all, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And second of all, it's going to end this war, because that's the economic backbone that the South, is holding it all together economically. Why would you let this institution keep, like, he was railing against all those efforts about, like, well, we can't really free slaves when we go into an enemy territory after we've conquered it. And people are like, what? Of course you can.
Well, that was another thing is Lincoln was so dead set on keeping things legal, and rightfully so, because he didn't want the war to end and then it all to fall apart. So I understand that, but I think Thaddeus Stevens was more about, we're going beyond the Constitution here. It's about what's right. What, those basic ideals that the Declaration stood for, the, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I really think he was grounded in that. And he says it goes beyond the Constitution. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm agreeing with you. It does go beyond the Constitution.
And I made a note on that with, let's see here, but Stevens was often too far in advance of his party, simply to compel and I can't even say the word, recalcitrant.
Yeah, you got it.
To do as he wished. He was so far ahead of the curve that he couldn't get everybody to come along, couldn't get them to agree. And I think this is where Stevens and Lincoln differed. Where Lincoln could, he could test the waters. He could get a feel for where public opinion is. Are we ready for this? It's all about timing. Where Stevens was all, no, let's just get it done. Let's go.
Yes.
And I really think that's I think they had similar ideas in a lot of instances. It's just the time frame.
Right. Right. And so that leads into, I was going to ask you about this, because I was curious about your take on, Stevens' philosophy versus, like fast, and Lincoln's, which was much more considered. It was calculated to an extent, so like politics is the art of the possible. And I think Lincoln had his finger on the pulse, and he was like, if I push too much right now, it could all go swirling off into the ether. And, and so I respect that. I understand that too, because not everything can be done in a sense of it's the right thing to do and it has to happen right now.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? Like, because sometimes I think in the book points that out, you do that and it could turn into something like the French Revolution or something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
The,
That
the
went off the
pendulum
rails.
swings way too far the other way.
Yes, yes. And I think Lincoln was fearful of that because, you know, the book does use the word revolutionary a lot. They call Stevens a revolutionary for, you know, Civil War revolutionary, right? And in a sense, it was a civil war, but it was also a revolution, right? A revolution within the Republican Party, within because basically you were ending one of the major economic you know
Institutions, yeah.
institutions that had grounded that country, unfortunately, almost from the very beginning. And it's like, what do you replace that with? You know, and that goes into Reconstruction, which really is wow, there's so much more to learn about that Reconstruction. We read that short book on Reconstruction and it was still like, whoa, there's so much here. And how could they have done it successfully? How long did troops need to stay there? I mean, did we take them out too soon? But, I don't know. I think Thaddeus Stevens was the revolutionary at the front saying, we need this. I know it's going to be painful, but it has to happen and we'll figure it out. But
well,
do you think that Lincoln could have moved any faster? I mean, what do you think?
In my opinion, I mean, now there's going to be people that argue with me and disagree with me. I think, honestly, he moved at the pace. I think he moved as fast as he could go and be successful at the same time without the whole thing falling apart. And if you follow my channel, everybody knows I'm a Lincoln fan. I mean, so I'm on board with what he did and how he did it. Now there's times when, I'm kind of angry, but when I sit back and I look at why he did that, okay, well, that does make sense. Because the book talks about is it David Hunter? Is that his first name, David?
Yes, it was David Hunter. Yeah, General David Hunter.
Yeah, down in the Florida, Georgia, South Carolina. Is that right?
One of those areas. It might have been New Orleans, I think.
But
or
I was like, it was southeast, but anyway, doesn't matter. Down in the Confederacy, he was the head general in one of those areas.
Yes.
And
let me see if I can find him.
He had emancipated the slaves, and Lincoln had to come back and say, nope, can't do that. And everybody was questioning him on him, including Thaddeus Stevens. But I think, I fully understand the reason why he did it. In order to win the war, he had to do it from a geographical standpoint. He had to have Kentucky. He had to have those states, those border states. And if he emancipates, it alienates them, and then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
And not everybody was seeing that big picture. And so, I guess in answer to your question, I honestly don't think he could have went any faster. Just because he was playing politics, but he was doing it with the pulse of the country in mind.
Right.
We'll just go back to that.
Yeah, he did. And a lot of the times he was also going by the Constitution, right?
Yes, he's trying to keep everything legal, because if this whole thing, I mean, it's just like the Emancipation Proclamation. He looked at it through the legal standpoint. They have the right to own property. The Constitution viewed slaves as property. He didn't like it, but that's the way it was written. So when he freed them in the South, he was freeing. He couldn't free the North because they were not at war. It was a war.
War measure or
war measure. Yeah, it was a war measure. And he knew that as soon as the war was over, that thing doesn't mean that Emancipation Proclamation really doesn't mean anything once the war's over. What really had to happen was that 13th Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
He was really just building up to that.
Okay.
And I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. That's a very sound argument. And I know many historians have made the same argument. And I don't disagree with you for that matter. I mean, I've always liked Lincoln. I'm a fan as well. He had his faults. Well, they all do. Shoot. But I still think he's one of our best presidents. He is our best president.
I was going to say, now come on.
Not one of the best.
The best.
Did you hear BookTube? Abraham Lincoln, the best president.
Number one.
Number one. I'll get a big foam finger, right? Number one. Anyway, well, the other thing that Stevens did during the war is he was one of the first voices to propose or be a proponent of arming the freed slaves, creating black regiments. And that was in light of what David Hunter did. And I did find that page. It just says, it was April of 1862, and David Hunter set out to arm liberated slaves in the Union's Department of the South, which I think it included such areas as South Carolina and Georgia. So I don't know how many states were included in the Department of the South, but he was very much early on, even before the Emancipation Proclamation, saying as the conquering Union armies moved in, those slaves should be freed. We're not talking about like, is it constitutional? These people are fighting us, like the Southerners. They're traitors, they're rebels, they're fighting us. This is now a war. We can take the slaves, we can free them. And they should be taking up arms to fight with us against them, which he says here, page 160. Says here that Stevens really agreed with he had no objection to what Hunter attempted. And on the contrary, he believed the general had pointed to the only road forward. It says here, quote, "I say that it is the duty of this government to follow out the policy which has been inaugurated by the gallant and sagacious soldier who now commands our army in South Carolina." And he said, "I am for sending the army through the whole slave population of the South and asking them to come from their masters, to take the weapons which we furnish, and to join us in this war of freedom against traitors and rebels." So I was like, right on.
Okay, so yeah, I had that one wrote down too.
Oh, you did?
And of course, I had the question: what is your opinion? Did Hunter do the correct thing, or was Lincoln correct?
Oh, now I'm gonna get caught in a. All right. Well,
you're with Hunter on it.
Yeah, I think I am. Now, look, coming from a military standpoint, okay, and I know that Lincoln's acting from the civilian official standpoint, but I see it as a military necessity. When you're trying to win a war, and you have to take away every possible resource, weapon that the enemy has. And one of those things was the slaves. Yes, they're people. But he said, but we need to remove that from them, that source of strength, power, some economic viability, because they were still working the land while they're off fighting. Well, take them away from doing that, and the crops don't come in, the economy falls apart, this war ends faster. So I think from a military standpoint, I think people like Fremont, General John C. Fremont, people who are moving ahead of Lincoln on this, I think we're right. I think you're right in the sense that Lincoln did not want to, he was very much against pissing off the border states. He's like, we cannot lose Kentucky. We cannot lose. There's a lot of people in Tennessee that are pro-union. I mean, he was really trying to keep some of those folks, like Upper Maryland. I mean,
well, I can't remember the exact quote, but we lose Kentucky, we lose the war. I mean, that was essentially,
yeah.
I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something like that.
Yeah. Now, whether that's true or not, we'll never know. It's hindsight. Yeah, we don't know. But I think, yeah, my answer to that is I think I would be with Hunter on that from a military standpoint. Whether that contradicted the Constitution, oh well, it was wartime. To me, when you're in a war, those things are.
Well, and Stephen says that when you're in and I can't remember where, I don't know if I must have wrote it down because it popped in my head. I typed up my notes, so it must have popped. He says, basically what you just said, when you're in wartime, Constitution's out the door. I mean, that's
right.
Because the bigger thing is saving the nation. You don't want to get, I wish I could find that.
I know there's so much good stuff in here.
Yeah, it was a good line. I won't find it.
Yeah, well, let me just say, if you're looking for it, that and what I don't have the page number either right now, but I know I read in here that even while the fighting was happening, you had people who were fighting against the Union complaining about their property being taken. As if the Constitution still applied to them. It's like you just left.
You
left. You're a traitor. You should
Mhm.
be hanging from a tree.
Mhm.
But you left. But they wanted it both ways.
Yeah, you can't have it both
they
ways.
wanted to leave, but they also wanted to be reimbursed for their slaves that they lost, or they wanted to sue in court. I'm like, this Constitution doesn't apply to you anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, so I get a little wound up because, I'm former military. Okay. And, it's like, yeah, those things, when you're there to get a certain job done, and that is to defeat someone who has declared themselves an enemy of the public good, of the public safety, of the Union. So none of that applies to you. And frankly, while we're fighting, the Constitution doesn't apply to you, the enemy. So
I like it.
that's just me. I get a little fired up, All right.
Speaking of, I think you had mentioned it earlier, Stephen's talking about bringing in African-American soldiers after they're freed, bringing them into the military. Another thing that I found that I took note of that I really appreciated, I put Stevens believed that Black men deserved equal pay in the Army because of the mercury and the danger and hardships they faced by entering the Army. And you talk about being way ahead of everybody.
Yeah.
I know Frederick Douglass was asking for it, but there weren't very many other people asking for equal pay.
No, let's just say it, white men.
Yeah.
Yeah, they weren't asking for it. And that's another reason why, I did come away from this book like, I need to know more about Stevens, because this guy is like one of my heroes now. You know what I mean?
He's definitely up the ladder for me.
He is way up there. You're right. And thanks for pointing that out. I'm so glad you remembered to talk about that point. I was just like that really, and again, the word revolutionary comes into play. His thinking was so revolutionary for the time, but he's like, this is only right. I think, to me, even if he was somehow not deeply enmeshed in his faith, he really lived it. He lived from a Christian standpoint. To me, as a Christian, he lived the belief that we are all God's children and equal in the eyes of God. So why would we not treat people the same, and not give them equal rights? And I think the more as his age progressed and he's marching towards, shuffling off the mortal coil, like we all will, he became even more radical, and just, and it's like you could have been talking to him like he was just, someone in our age, I think he was that progressive in his beliefs for equal rights and human value,
It's just past the point of caring what people thought about it. And that's, it's, you've talked to the older generation, you know what I'm talking about. When you get to some older people, you don't usually see it with young people because they're worried about what everybody thinks, but the older people are like, I've lived it. I don't care what you think.
I don't care what you think.
Stevens.
That's Stevens.
Something I noted here at the very end of my notes that I really loved was on his tombstone. He says, I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules, I have chosen this that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his creator. And that kind of comes right back to what you were just talking about. And
that is beautiful.
Yeah, and he was buried in a cemetery that allowed African Americans to be buried there also.
Yeah. That's why he chose it. Yeah.
Did that on purpose because in the time period, most, there was the white cemetery and the black cemetery. Everything was separate, and so he chose equality. He wanted to end his. That was his way of, this has been my life struggle. And I'm going to live. I'm going to live what I taught, or how do I want to say that?
Well, you know what? He and even in death, he was living out.
Yes.
His life's mission.
Yes.
And it was the capstone. Because his journey on earth was over, but that was his final statement on it, his final stamp.
He wasn't talking the talk. He was walking.
And I love that. Oh, I actually, when I read that, the tombstone, the epitaph, I had like, got a little misty
Goose pimples.
in goose pimple.
That was powerful.
Yeah, he was amazing. And I was also moved by later in life, and I know we're going back a little bit to like after Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, another one of our favorites, right? And I'm saying that sarcastically.
He might be just above Buchanan. And I don't even know why he's above. Maybe they need the same rung.
Well, for being the worst.
The ladder. Maybe
Yeah,
one for each foot.
Which one is the worst? Buchanan, Johnson.
Both
well,
idiots.
I think Buchanan, because he did nothing to stop what was coming, or at least try to do something. And then so I think Buchanan's the worst, and Johnson's right underneath it.
Right. Yeah.
Johnson, President Andrew Johnson, who obviously, and for some of you who don't know, who he was Lincoln's vice president, and Lincoln had chosen him, right, for
political purposes.
And I know that there was a comment you and I have both replied to in one of your other videos about who was to blame for something. And I was just like, well,
he was rewarding a Democrat who was loyal to the Union.
Yeah.
And I feel Lincoln fully believed that if you want the South, if you want this thing to come back together, the South has to get on board with it. They have to feel an ownership here. And so he was throwing them a bone. And, he let Johnson on the ticket to show that I will extend that hand of unity, that I'm willing to make peace here.
Right. Because Johnson was, even though he was Southerner, he was a Unionist. And I think that's what Lincoln was trying to show. Like, look, there's Southerners out there who believe in the Union. And Johnson was
not just a border state, not just a border state, but a Confederate state.
Yes. And he was trying to show that there are Southern Unionists out there, and he was trying to appeal to them, obviously, and to a sense of like, look, we can work this out. Interesting thing about Johnson is, in the beginning, he voiced a lot of, and probably for political purposes, because his true nature came out later after Lincoln was gone, but he supported Lincoln's, proposed policy, going into the end of the Civil War and what he was proposing for Reconstruction. But Johnson, he had a beef against it was almost like a class thing with Johnson. He came from like low, hard scrabble conditions, and he had a beef against the large, rich plantation owners in the South. And so a lot of people thought that with Johnson, he just wanted to stick it to them, but then he did an about face, which was so strange for him. He really hated them. But when he became president, then he started pandering and placating the South and refusing to enact some of the more radical Reconstructionist, or radical Republican policies that, Stanton and some of the others were, encouraging as far as enforcing Reconstruction. But Stevens really hated him.
That's a minor way of putting it.
So, but as he was getting older and frailer, he was still part of that little circle of people. I think it included, and there's a great picture of him with Benjamin Butler, that old crazy guy from the New Orleans. There's a picture of them. They came together. Let me see if I can get that right here. Mm-hmm. They came together to put together the art impeaching. They wanted to impeach Andrew Johnson. And he was very old and frail. As you can see, he's got a cane up in here, there he is right here. It's kind of like shriveled into himself. He's, very kind of, he was going downhill. I love the image though of during the impeachment trial or the impeachment hearings, they carried him in on a chair because he was so sick. There it is right there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But he was like, I'm going to be there. Come hell or high water, I'm going to be there for that. Yeah, it was the trial. Oh, and another thing I thought was really cool, and this is right above the picture of the epitaph that you read. When he died and his coffin was laying in state or lying in state in the U.S. Capitol's rotunda, he had a regiment of black regiment like guarding the body.
Mm-hmm.
There's a picture of that, you guys, up here. I had never seen this picture before.
I had neither.
I thought I've seen every picture of the Civil War there is. So I got so giddy, you guys, when I saw this. I'm like, that's his coffin. He's lying in that coffin right now, you know? And then I'm looking at the rotunda like, and I'm like, look at that funky statue of Lincoln. Like that's not there anymore. You know, that's like it's just like, how has it changed? And oh, it just blows my mind. Anyway, I got geeked out when I see unseen photos of the like Civil War stuff. It's cool. But gosh, what else? I think we've really covered a lot about Stevens. Yeah, we've covered his evolution, his political evolution, but you know, more is to be said really about he was trying to find the right party, like you said, for the longest time. But you know, when he left the Whigs when he saw that basically they were just only interested in protecting their own power and the balance of power in Congress, and he really wanted to affect change. You know,
he wanted to be a part of a party that was going to be able to make that change. Because like you had the Liberty Party, and he could have become a part of that, and he chose not to because he knew they weren't going to get elected. And yep. And he stuck with the Whigs, right? At that point.
Yes.
He stuck with them because he knew they would at least stick around and he could make some change. But he definitely was a revolutionary. He was wanting the big changes. He was way ahead of his time.
Way ahead.
Definitely one of my new heroes.
Mine too. And I really, all I can say is I'm going to continue to look for more books on Thaddeus Stevens, but for everyone out there who's just maybe new to Thad Stevens, there you go. I think this was a very good read, a very worthwhile investment of your time, and it's not too thick. I mean,
read it pretty quick.
Yeah, I think we were reading a few chapters every week. We were done in a couple weeks or 3 weeks at the most. But this was a great book, Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary Fighter for Racial Justice by Bruce Levine. And yeah, I think I'm going to look for the Fawn Brody book next.
Let me know when you get it, because I have it.
You have it.
I have it. Haven't read it yet. That was one of my great finds at my used bookstore.
Oh, you're so lucky. Well, I'll start looking on my used book networks online. Start digging deep into the internets.
The archives. Well, I definitely, for me, I give it a thumbs up.
I do too.
Good read. I'd recommend it to anybody, especially like you said, as a starter for anybody wanting to get into the time period and into the man's life.
There's my thumbs up. Boom. Yeah,
not just about Thaddeus Stevens in general, but also, like you said, the antebellum period and the Civil War era. So for reading this book with me. I really appreciate that.
Yes. Should we tell the people, because I think this is a new thing with us. We'll do another book chat again. Should we tell the good people out there the next book we've chosen?
Is it September we said?
Is that what we said? I thought it was October.
October? Okay, she's pushing. No, I'm kidding.
No!
That's probably what you said.
Well, because you said you're going into the...
Well, like I said, you remind me.
Okay.
I will forget by that time.
Because I think you said November in your school, you're going to be covering some of this. Was it November and December you're covering that unit?
Yeah, you're right. It was October.
Okay. It's October.
But we're going to be reading Meacham.
Yep.
John Meacham's book.
Oh, hang on a second. It's called The Power of I can't believe it. One moment. I know here. Yes. Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you.
There we go. I've had it on my bookshelf.
I had to Google it.
Maybe 2 years, and hadn't read it. And
same.
We saw it at Second and Charles, didn't we?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
And we
it-
both were like, I have it. And I started reading it maybe like 10 pages in and something distracted me. And you said you had it. And I'm like, this could be a really good next buddy read.
Yep. And everybody says it's a great book.
Yes.
So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to read that with you, and we'll do another chat.
We're going to have another book chat, everybody. So that'll be coming probably, well, later in the fall, but you're going to be busy with school for a while. So
Oh, yeah.
I don't think we'll have anything in between there, but we'll have our booktube videos. We can touch base and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, so thanks for watching, everybody. And again, Thaddeus Stevens, check him out. He was a revolutionary mind and a hero for the ages.
Yep.
So until next time, booktube. Bye.
Happy reading.
There you go. What he said.